So what are the different forms of TRT available? Largely, what we see, and I'll go into the pros and cons of each of these, but we see injections, gels, patches, troches, and pellets. There are intranasal, and I believe there's a few like oral options as well. I'm not as familiar with the oral options or the intranasal, but I'll talk about the ones that I am familiar with. The injections, they provide a very direct method of administration. And yes, the dosage can vary. And what you'll typically see is that if you go to a traditional provider, like I'm talking like not a private clinic, if you opt for injections, they could very well recommend injecting weekly or biweekly or monthly, depending on the individual's needs. Now, I'll just jump the gun here and tell you that like once a week dose is the lowest frequency that I would go to. Biweekly, especially for the female athlete, is not going to provide stability in levels, but even for the male athlete, we do have some pretty old studies that compare, biweekly, monthly, as well as once a week dosing and what that does to serum levels. But essentially, we want stability in levels in order to minimize the potential risk of adverse effects. Now, injections, they do tend to have rapid effects, but maintaining stable levels requires precise timing and more frequent administration. And I think a good rule of thumb for anyone is like, if you can inject more frequently, this is going to get you closer to mimicking your natural peak and trough of endogenous testosterone production. Now I'm going to go deeper into injections between like sub-Q and intramuscular, because that's something I get asked about all the time. But let's talk about gels and patches. Now, these can offer technically a more consistent release of testosterone, and they're applied daily, which I think is really where people find like the ease of application. If again, we're talking about a traditional provider where you have to go in to get the injection, this is an option where you wouldn't necessarily have to drive to them to get them to apply your cream. So I mean, like the actual user skill needed to apply these is yes, it is lower than doing an injection, but I'll go into injections. It is not something that I think requires a high degree of skill and can honestly be taught to both men and women for home lab application. Gels definitely do have a risk of transferring to others through skin to skin contact. Patches can cause skin irritation, but both are generally well suited for individuals seeking gradual absorption. When we look at like troches and oral options, I mean, these forms dissolve in the mouth and are ingested. So, it's a convenient alternative. However, really like my thoughts when it comes to gels, patches, troches, I fuck that up every time, sorry, and oral options is that they're metabolized by the liver differently. And specifically for the athlete who is also, maybe on like thyroid replacement hormone or who is going through different phases, like chronically in and out of like contest prep, and you find that like, okay, at sometimes at times of the year, your metabolism is functioning better than other times, you could have a discrepancy in the pharmacokinetics here. Now with the gels and creams, like the issue I see is that like you're not able to administer the same amount every single time. Like, yes, they'll be like, okay, one click, but I see this being problematic. And more often than not, when I start to investigate, like I really try to stress like, hey, if you're going to go about it this route, like you should be like very cognizant that you're doing the exact amount that's recommended, because if you do double because you're feeling like shit one day and you want more energy, this isn't going to result in just the positive benefits. And if this takes you above a range in which you can tolerate, there could be negative effects to this. So understand too with troches and oral options, because they're metabolized by the liver, this can increase the risk of elevated liver enzymes, which it shouldn't necessarily be a high elevation. We're not talking like 200 or 300s, but it is something to consider if you do have comorbidities related to hepatic function. Now, troches are oh god, I promise I know the word, guys. Troches are less commonly used, but I would say that like there are individuals who just are completely like against needles, injections. They're not willing to consider that as an active form. So I mean, like I think that could be a seemingly okay alternative. When we consider something like pellets, this is where really I start to say like, I don't see a good use for them, because I mean, like, you're front loading a drug that again has a very narrow therapeutic index, meaning that like if you go too high, you will experience, like, more than likely you will experience negative side effects. So unwanted, irreversible androgenic effects, probably. I know a lot of women who've had pellets and they've sustained levels in the 200 to 300s, and maybe the side effects were very, very minimal, but they still experienced them. Almost always when I talk to individuals who've gone through pellet therapy. And the other thing that you have to understand is too, like, pellets are a very quick way for clinics to like profit off of prescribing testosterone. So like ethically, I just kind of have a stink about that, because I'm like, well, is this really beneficial to the client? Is this the best way for them to be using this drug? Because like it has to stay in for several months. I mean, like, I think it's like 2 to 6 months, depending on what kind it is. And I see this being problematic, specifically for the client who's like, hey, I want to increase my libido a little bit, because like you're taking levels very much what could be like 20 to 40 nanograms per deciliter. And if you were putting them in the 200 to 300 reference range, it's like, that's going to be a very intense change for them. Like the magnitude of a change, yes, side effects are a big consideration, but also just like overall well-being for that client. Like I doubt they're going to feel their best. And that isn't what I've found consistently reported for individuals making that great of a jump. But you'll hear a lot of people, a lot of bodybuilders, a lot of idiots online who will say that you can't inject testosterone subcutaneously, or it will cause an infection, or it won't be absorbed, or won't be as effective as opposed to injecting it intramuscularly. So understand, like, if you're injecting intramuscularly, you're typically using a lower gauge needle. So the needle that is most commonly used is like a 28 gauge needle, meaning it's wider in diameter, versus if we're talking subcutaneous, you're using an insulin needle that is like 31 to 30 gauges, meaning that like that's going to be much smaller. And you're also looking at the length of the needle in millimeters, which like I prefer, if you can access it, getting a 6 millimeter length. And this is different from the volume of the syringe. I'm talking about the needle length here. But typically when I talk to individuals who are very needle averse, like who don't want to inject using a needle, how the fuck else would you inject? Once I start to like explore, like, okay, where's the fear from? Is it around like pain or like hurting yourself or having to see it go in? And then like I get a clear idea. I'm like, I think that they have this idea that you have to inject using like a really long, very thick needle that, I mean, fuck, it is painful. Like, I mean, that's how I injected L-carnitine for the longest time. And frankly, like there is literature to support that like intramuscular injections put you at a higher risk for infection as opposed to subcutaneous. And it's really quite the opposite. Like, it's not to say that subcutaneous injections are completely risk-free, and you need to be mindful of like whether or not you're cleaning the site and just like general hygiene, because it does need to be a sterile technique. But subcutaneous testosterone is FDA approved, and it's arguably safer than intramuscular injections. And frankly, I would say like when I parallel it for individuals, I'm like, consider like a child, like a child who's technically allowed to inject insulin, or an elderly person, like they're injecting using an insulin needle probably daily, specifically if they have, a condition that requires that. And in that case, I think when I can like show them like, hey, you don't need to use this like harpoon of a needle, I think people tend to come around with the idea, okay, well, like this method ultimately allows for the most stability in levels, which the other thing I wanted to mention too is like, you need to be able to check serum levels adequately, which is another big drawback when you're looking at gels, creams, or troches, is like the way that your body breaks down the drug, and then the way that the drug interacts with your body. I mean, like that's highly variable, which with such a narrow therapeutic index, we need to make sure that we have a very accurate way that we're capturing serum levels. So another advantage of subcutaneous injections when we're talking about TRT is we're able to then inject a lower dose, meaning we're able to microdose essentially. So there's less conversion to DHT. So there's less risk of thicker blood, less risk of erythrocytosis, less of this like, a fight or flight drive, which I'm hesitant to say like you're going to actually feel that. My peaks, like I do daily injections, and I right now I use like, I'm at 3.5 milligrams a week. So it's 0.5 milligram a day. I had to think about that because I came down previously. I was at like 6. And then when I switched to the new source, I was like, 6 is way too high. But in terms of the actual experience of like the drug, it's going to be less intense. And like, I do have a girlfriend who like, she injects very like once a week, but she's also at a dose that I do not recommend. She's at 25 milligrams a week. She sits way, way, way too high. And she's like, yep, I like it. I like how it feels. But she even said, she's like, hey, between injections, like, I don't want to inject more, but is there a way to like mellow out, that surge? Because like, I feel really shitty prior to my next injection, like the 3 days before my training is impacted. And that's where really, like, I really want to emphasize, like, you're not going to necessarily feel testosterone in the way you would feel Anavar. It's not going to be something that just hits you in the face and you're just like, oh, like I'm aggressive, and like certainly not going to change your personality. The purpose of it in our use, like, is really to make sure that we're restoring well-being that should already be there. Like, we're restoring a natural well-being. And sure, you want to go into sport mode and like sit in that like upper end of like, 80, 90, 100 nanograms per deciliter. Cool. Like, you can yield a lot of progress out of that. But we also have to consider how this is weighted against when we look at those androgenic side effects, because testosterone is an anabolic androgenic steroid. When we think of those androgenic effects, we typically think of like oily skin, acne, hair loss, and typically DHT is responsible for that. So that's why I think it's important to get DHT levels checked. In addition, when we're getting that initial panel checked, you don't need the DHT to get the full benefits of testosterone. Testosterone in itself is the anabolic, and it's responsible for building things. And frankly, I think a lot of people just assume like more is better. And this is something I was talking to a client about recently, because he's like wanting to start TRT. And he's like, okay, but even though I don't want to bodybuild, like, why wouldn't I go higher? Like, why wouldn't I just keep going high enough till I reach my goals? And I explained to him, like, there's a point in which you will start to convert, and like estrogen will become a problem, but so will DHT. And like with hair loss being his primary concern, I'm like, there's no free ride. Like, there's a point where you are going to get, I would say that's the equivalent of like, it's the male virilization, is that like, you're going to start losing your hair. You're going to start having those negative effects that frankly, I don't think anyone wants. Some people accept given their goals, but when we think about like the cost of TRT, like, it's incredibly cheap, and you don't need a lot of it to give you that supportive therapy, to give you that coverage. And for males, like, you can get like pretty much 2 grams for around $50 from a compounding pharmacy. Syringes are really cheap as well. So, like, we're talking like $15 to $30 for 100 syringes. And for females, like, we should be using a lower concentration bottle. And realistically, you should be able to access anywhere from 7 to 10 mLs per bottle, concentrated at 10 to 50 milligrams per ml for like $60 to $100 a bottle. Now, despite testosterone being so cheap, the reality is, like, there are clinics, there are private businesses that are profit driven and will inadvertently recommend, methods that are more costly to the consumer. So they'll perform surgeries like with the pellet. They'll even require you to come in and get the administration of the testosterone. And I really think like this is something that if people understood and just like thought about it more, like, okay, this isn't a business that is subsidized. Like, they are ultimately looking at how to increase their bottom line. And really, when we consider like the downsides to injections, like, yes, it is an injection, so there's a needle puncturing the skin. And that can be painful to some people. It can cause reactions. It can absolutely increase red blood cell count compared to like nasal or capsule forms. But as long as you understand, okay, here is how we reduce the risk of reactions and infections, which I'm telling you, like, this isn't something that's hard to do. Like, it is very much common sense that you use an alcohol prep pad, you clean the site, you clean the top of the bottle, you use a sterile technique, you inject, you use one needle per injection, you discard safely. There isn't a lot that goes into it past that. But there are a lot of individuals who get lazy with general administration, hygiene, and as well as, monitoring, prophylactically for any of the adverse effects related to other system disorders. I think like when we're talking about the female athlete, yes, you could consider these alternative forms. I'm going to be honest, I don't know a lot about like nasal forms and how that translates into measuring serum levels, but I would say when we consider the cost of injections and then the control over being able to inject and then very immediately adjust the dose, I feel like this is a really big benefit across all other routes of administration.